So we're really happy to have Andres here with us today in this super interesting topic. Um, so around the world, societies are experiencing rising polarization, declining trust, and weakening support for peace and democratic cooperation. Even countries that have formally ended violent conflict increasingly struggle to sustain reconciliation and coexistence over time. Why is cooperation becoming harder, and what can science do about it? So this talk will introduce the work of Neuropaz, an international initiative born in Colombia that applies insights from neuroscience and behavioral sciences to one of the most urgent challenges of our time: how to build societies psychological capable of sustaining peace in an era of uncertainty, technological disruption, and social fragmentation, what many scholars now call the metacrisis. Drawing on cutting-edge research and real-world applications, we have Andres with us today that will explore how human decision-making changes under conditions of threat and polarization. When people feel insecure or socially threatened, the brain tends to prioritize identity protection and emotional certainty over openness and cooperation. This state, the mindfreeze state, will help explain why dialogue efforts often stall, why misinformation spreads easily, and why international rules alone are not enough to transform social relationships. Andres will also present for us a new approach that is a multi level approach in which effective cooperation requires both strong governance structure and supportive social norms. This is our first behavioral Bessy's Global South event for the year, and we're really happy to have all of you here. I'm alongside with Amelia, Carol, Amara, and Divi, setting up this group. We've shared our social media and LinkedIn, WhatsApp, and YouTube, so feel free to join in case you haven't yet. And uh, now let me introduce our guest, Andres. Andres is a behavior and decision scientist from the University of Pennsylvania. He has a Master of Philosophy and a political scientist from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. He's a dual doctoral researcher on conflict resolution and mediation from Tel Aviv University, and in neuroscience in the medicine faculty at Javeriana University. So has a really multidisciplinary background, let's say. He's the author of several books, scientific publications, policy report, and award-winning science communication content. He's also a research fellow at the Boris Minsk Institute and a lecturer for executive programs at the Business School and the School of Government at Los Andes University. Just in terms of housekeeping, we'll have a 20-minute presentation from Andres. Then we'll have a round of questions and open for questions for all of you. Please feel free to do the questions on your own, unmuting yourselves, or send it in the chat if you prefer. So on that note, with you, Andres, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Flora, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor and a dream of mine being part of this network, and especially having the opportunity to speak, and especially to speak to colleagues from all over the world, and especially those of us who are working hard to get our networks heard across the behavioral science spectrum. So I'm extremely happy. And yeah, no further ado, I will start. I'm going to share my screen with the hope that this talk is of interest and brings something new or at least nutritious to your minds. So I'm going to stop my video just in case our connection doesn't work. Can you please confirm if you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So let's start. So the first thing is when I got invited to this great space, I was thinking what would be interesting to talk about, and obviously the world that we're living in each day, it's like a complete year of events and craziness and pain. So in a sense, I dedicate these reflections to all the communities that are suffering now and to all of us who are glued to the news, seeing how suffering is ubiquitous right now in the world. And I hope that people that you know can be safe, and people who are in difficult situations right now, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere, are safe and healthy and can find peace. And I think that's why many of us decided to go into science, especially applied science, and connect the bridge with practice. And that's where Neuropaz comes in as an idea that we started with a colleague of mine, that's Emile Bruno, many years ago in when I was his student. And this talk is also part of the work that we do in our network to keep Emile's neuroscience and human legacy alive. So today I want to speak especially to this audience about something that's very important in moments where cognitive, like dissonance, and especially the cognitive load that we have, the emotional distress, and especially the fatigue that we have with these topics will basically push us just to turn over our heads and maybe let things just flow and see if tomorrow will be a better moment. So for us, I know those of us who have been beaten by the bug of social change, we have, rather than an ethical commitment, we have like a force that doesn't allow us to drop the ball. And especially, I identify a lot with the Sisyphus myth because I think that crazy story defines a lot of what we do. Those of us who are working to, in a sense, put science to work for peace and social and pro-social and inclusive change around the world. So this talk is gonna basically try to touch in these minutes on 5 things. So please bear with me, especially apologies because I know it's a lot of big things that I'm saying, at least in this content slide. But I think I just want to start a conversation among us, and I hope we can replicate it and iterate it in other spaces. So first, my first argument or my first question is basically, why is cooperation becoming harder in such a moment when we, at least those of us who at least are in my generation, someone called us sexennials, well, senials or whatever, because we are between generations and we are kind of, like in the sandwich of this crazy time. So I want to talk from that voice that it's my identity, and I also want to stress the fact that building peace in an era of uncertainty, technological disruption, and social fragmentation could be a great opportunity to get together and start something that can help us also move forward. And that's where the Rewire argument and proposal comes into this talk. And finally, I will move towards what a behavioral informed systems governance might look like, using an argument of a Colombian colleague that's called Juan Camilo Cárdenas, who has been working, like for many years, keeping also Elinor Ostrom's work around the world on environmental peace building and environmental behavioral science. So I'm going to end basically offering some ideas on how peace in our time should not be understood only as political agreement. We have to go beyond, and we need to understand how science practice and community participation, especially learned from those successful cases in the global South, can move us to something that I like to call the new psychological pact. So let me begin with a remarkable discovery from neuroscience. This is a very beautiful piece that I found a couple of weeks ago, and it really inspired me to open the talk by basically acknowledging this discovery. When people who were born blind gain sight later in life, the hardest part is not opening their eyes. The real challenge is teaching the brain how to see. Even after surgery restores vision, the brain initially struggles to interpret what it is seeing. Faces look unfamiliar, objects are difficult to recognize, depth and distance are confusing. Why? Because the brain has never learned how to process visual information. Seeing is not automatic. It is something the brain must learn. Over time, through experience and training, new neural pathways form. Gradually, the brain begins to organize the visual world. What was once chaotic becomes meaningful. Peace works in a very similar way. Ending violence is like restoring sight. But societies must still learn how to see one another again. They must rebuild trust. They must reinterpret disagreement. They must rediscover how to cooperate. And this process obviously takes time, practice, and new social environments. In other words, societies must rewire how they perceive each other. And that is what I mean when I talk about rewiring peace. So, bringing a quote from one of my favorite bands from the 80s and the 90s, REM, I like to propose this question. Is the end of the world as we know it, and the last weeks have tons of news, and we have basically, in this image, evokes a little bit of what the positions are, kind of, selling this idea that going back to a rules-based order is not an option. So we are again in our natural states, a kind of an infinite and person prisoner's dilemma. Or we can hear other voices, for example, the great speech in Raisina that Alexander Stubb did in India a couple of days ago, that really inspired me to think that, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And maybe cynicism and fear must not be the rule here. So I asked, obviously, AI to help me understand those two positions. And what I got is, first, this crisis opportunity opens like two doors, right? So like the neo problem, right? You have two peels. So we can, walk the path of all this data that has, show us this result that is a VUCA world, a world that's marked by volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments, that is expressing as a polycrisis, climate, geopolitical, economic, pandemic, and technological disruption. And then, given in the heavily interconnected nature of our global current uh, family, as I like to call it, because I believe we are a family, the meta crisis comes in. And that concept has been developed to understand the effects of this storm that it has been forming for decades. So we have a governance failure, institutional distrust, economic paradigm stress, cultural and cognitive shifts, and technological acceleration, which we see not only in the news, in our lives, in our families, in our societies, in our streets, but we also are seeing the great amount of especially production in behavioral science that I really want to touch upon today. And then we have this situation when we can also, go and move a little bit and try to respond rather than to react, and see that this is a great opportunity, as the president Stubb was saying, and it's basically the opportunity to align human psychology, social norms, and institutions. And then the AI, you know, obviously it's biased by my work and the work that I do using it. And I basically came back with this, or it came back with this idea. First, the idea that the brain will react to such context, a scenario with threat perception, identity, and empathy as a mechanism, first to the in group, going back to rallying around the flag and the family, as going back to the status quo where we feel safe. And then we have this problem that the brain obviously wants to take care of us. As I say, the brain is an annoying friend that becomes very useful when we are under threat and we need to survive. And then a beautiful thing that we have, that it's cognitive flexibility, shuts down and the world becomes a threat, right? So we have the opportunity because we have learned about these things. We have also learned about the power of social norms, that are based also in an important, I would say, invisible infrastructure that make cooperation possible. And then we have those institutions that today are eroded and people feel that they are obsolete. And that's where the conundrum starts. So here, basically, what I want to stress is the idea that when we do behavioral science, we're not being naive about politics. We are not being naive about structural change. We're not being naive about the market, or we're not being naive about inequality and those horrible things that many of our societies keep as the path dependency that deals with getting us just to be tightly, I would say, oppressed by the past. So, in this thing that I'm trying to get out now on this idea that behavioral science is not just this kind of makeup that we put upon some nice notches and stuff, but it's a serious way to understand how the bottom up process can change the system. So we have these three structural dynamics that are converging. One is this idea of an order transition, right? What opportunity do we have as behavioral scientists from our countries, wherever they are positioned in this world geography, right? How we can take advantage of this opportunity of power distribution that is shifting globally, right? So one question is how the order in science is changing, how the distribution of that knowledge production is changing. Secondly, is institutional misalignment something that could help us open an opportunity not only for research, not only for practice, but specifically for collective action in order to affect those governance structures that are now outdated and need new ways, models, schemas, or at least new ways to follow. And then we have the systemic risk. In fact, now there's a big interest on people to not only learn how to code, but also be able to adopt the science of risk. That it's, one of the disciplines that is becoming very important, right? So we have technology, climate, and conflict that are interacting to create this very, very, I would say, systemic uncertainty. Okay, but what I take from this idea that the world is changing is that the world is entering this systemic transition where this core feature of the metacrisis can open the importance of bringing psychology and norms as the way of, people call them soft solutions, but I call them invisible and enabling infrastructures that are powerful because they are, in a sense, they are not costly, right? They are embedded in our DNA as humans, but then they are empowered and driven by the problem, right? The problem of the in group and the out group. And finally, we have the new governance architectures that are needed, and that's where political scientists, political economists, and people who used to think from the macro perspective, even though they were using individual methodological individualism, they still had that divide between the structure, the agency, or the individual and the system. Okay, so in that context, stop, open an idea. And he says there are 7 things that are important to understand. And I just want, since we are here in this group who thinks about behavioral systems, who think about how the global south is changing the way we study human nature and how context defines that we will say that black box that needed to be open to understand how change can really happen and how it can sustainably be moving forward throughout the years, not just days, months, or specific geographies, right? So we have that power now. And it's very important because the second argument that Stubb makes is the rise of the global south. And then we have like these big discussions. And that's why it's so exciting to be doing behavioral science in 2026 in such a mess of a world, because these discussions have taken us to this moment, right? We all know this new book by Chatter and Lowenstein, who started this big discussion almost 10 years ago about this divide between the I would say the I domain or the I level, the individual level, and the systems level, right? So we have that divide. But it's very important because the message of this book made me first like, okay, The arguments are solid. It's great because obviously we don't want to be naive. Those of us who have worked and shaped policy in our countries know that we have been criticized, some for nudging, others for just relying on social norms that will disappear if there are not influencers in the network iterated throughout the years, etc., etc. So it's very interesting because this book opens a door that I'm gonna basically use it for this argument. And it's basically things that we, even though everybody says we know that, but do our models know that, right? Behavior is shaped by systems. Okay, policies must address power and incentives. And the lovely work that Resarta Bilali and her colleagues are doing is trying to build this idea of behavioral geopolitics. Not only to put another name to geopolitics, it's understanding the other underlying dynamics that allow us ethically also to have a commitment not only to intervene, to have a nice paper, but intervene using basically all the thoughts, all the knowledge and the methods and the power that our knowledge, scientific knowledge has, but also guided by communities to help them deliberate and transform their own and empower their own leading force in their own context. And then we have this problem that it's beautiful is how behavioral tools can complement structural reform, not replace it. And that's very important because the tendency of the world to institutionalize democracies or other systems, hybrid systems, especially in the global south, in the promise of direct solutions, effectiveness, etc., things that were not being done by the liberal democracy orders. So what can we do as behavioral scientists? So I really love that because then we have this opportunity where, for me, the reading of this book made me think, okay, so the important thing is understanding that behavioral science risks shifting responsibility from institutions to individuals. That's right. And I think most people on this audience may agree with me. And these papers led by Heinrich or Sakshi Gai in last year, especially about not only the weird problem in science, but also the masking problem on how when we turn insights into policy, right? So we have this real promise of behavioral science that we can, and that's why I brought in Daron Acemoglu's, the Nobel laureate in economics, take on the book. And it's basically what he says. This is a masterclass on how to blend individual psychology with institutions so that people are encouraged to get involved and develop solutions to our urgent problem via the democratic process. So I'm going to take away the idea that we can, through science, and you and me and all of us who have worked on the field doing these field experiments or co-creating solutions with teams and with colleagues and with the populations that stop being participants and are now, in a sense, citizen researchers that come up with us to do this. We understand the power of behavioral science to encourage people to get involved and develop solutions. So to move on a little bit faster in order that the time is moving, so I want to just pose 5 elements for the conversation. One is, it is certain, empirically certain, that cooperation is becoming harder, right? And there's, like this evident situation where trust has been in decline. We have also a problem with cross-group trust hesitation. Obviously, the other, as some painter in the 20th century said, the problem are the others, right? Not me. So I'm doing everything. We are perfect, but the others or the other are great, are a great threat. And then we have the perceived polarization that is on the rise. And finally, we have this cross-ideological information that is making people to live in different universes and common knowledge disappearing as something that was the, like the baseline for our socialization process before. But now, these 4 erosions of cooperation, trust erosion, polarization, cross-group distrust, and information, are posing an additional problem. And it's basically the idea, and is I take from this beautiful last report that I'm gonna talk about in a few seconds, made by Mareke Shomerus from Busara and her colleagues for the World Bank. And it's basically understanding now that our tools like upon the layers of suffering, inequality, patriarchalism, etc., etc., we have the problem of the world plunging into interstate wars and conflicts, violent conflicts, and then the problem of the internationalized intrastate problems, right? So now we have, as I wanted to pose, a problem that is mind freeze. Normally, when the world becomes a threat to you, the effect, as Amodio and colleagues, Mina Chikara, many other neuroscientists have shown us on the lab, is basically the effects that the effect that uncertainty has in paralyzing our brains into mind freeze, into closing the pathways for change and to change the views that are needed to survive, right? So that's where behavioral science also not only seeing understanding the problem with automatic thinking, but also the problem where norms are the result of that automatic thinking, and then scaling that through schemas and scripts to mental models and narratives, and then reinforcing that through, symbolic, linguistic, or physical infrastructures that mold and bring a feedback loop to that learning. Okay. Secondly, we have the problem on, okay, if this is the mess of a world where we're going to work, behavioral scientists are demanded, or they have a choice. I believe that it's better to understand it that way, that our problem is not just, like nudging people for change. I think we all agree on that. Now the problem, it's bigger because we need it to unfreeze, I would say, an iceberg that becomes very solid and rigid when the world is a threat, at the, I would say, at the cherry on top of everything, right? So we have this meta crisis that affects the psychological threat response that we all get into because it's inevitable. We were discussing with Emilia, being glued to the news, what's going on in Iran, what's going on in Sudan, what's going on in my own country, Colombia. So it's, we are in this meta crisis that it's there in our, in our meals. So we have also this psychological threat response that would conduce to a breakdown of cooperation, as I was saying, making cooperation a great deal of effort in these times. Or maybe for many people, a bad business, as we're seeing on the retreat of funds to fund this type of research around the world. So that behavioral system redesign is needed because mind freeze not only affects people and can become obvious a serious illness in the brain and in the body, as we know, for trauma, as we know, for brain health in general. But the problem here is how can us, as architectures of social change, of that beautiful, I will call science of the imperfection that we have learned, it's becoming, more central, the importance of understanding the limits of our own architecture in behavioral and brain and behavioral science. So my proposal here to move on and start closing my talk is basically that sustainable peace and cooperation may, may uh, 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 be, like empowered and also driven by four pillars. One of them is something that it's very important. I'm going to talk about that because behavioral science is working more and more on psychological resilience. So how we can enhance trust between groups, how we can rather to get people to tolerate each other, how can we teach, how we can experience, and how we can adopt skills to foster cognitive flexibility, how we can counter radicalization, but getting people to stop and understand the terrible protracted events that will follow when we fall immediately to radicalization. Also, prosocial norms, behavioral informed institutions that we're moving toward that, and responsible technology governments. And the good news that I had for you is that a lot of leading work is being done from the behavioral science work. Just to cite some of my favorite, many of them, most of them have presented and have been part in Neuropaz in the past. We have the great Lior Smigrod with her new book, The Ideological Brain, who has shown us the importance of bringing, a new tactic, a new mechanism that it's cognitive, cognitive, how we can um, increase and get the brain to learn a default for cognitive flexibility. As following also the work of Nafis Hamid and many others in the UK who have learned to also differentiate what works and what doesn't, depending on the motivations for radicalism, especially violent radicalism, like sacred values. Then we have the great book by Emily Falk, What We Value, the importance of understanding the power of values to change societies, with 20, 25 years of research in the lab and on the field. In fact, she worked a lot with Emile Bruno, and I met her in my time in the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience lab when she was working with Emile there. Have the pleasure to meet her and learn more about how she conduces her work, and also all these other books that I'm sure you are familiar with, especially those who are working on polarization. And then we have this great new book by Bargill and Sunstein on algorithmic harm. So behavioral science is not marginal. We are not the naive scientists. We are these people who are taking seriously how to not only produce new theory, right, understand causality of things, but also bringing three things that are key. First, as in the new book that is going to come out this year, and I'm so excited by it, the great Carla Hoff, who started the revolution within the World Bank with the Man, Society, and Behavior report, Joseph Stiglitz, and Alison Demerit, who has done incredible field research around the world, are offering this new book to understand that there's another invisible hand to change our reality, and that's the power of culture. Then we have this new book that is also coming this year, and that's why I'm so excited. It's Bescy Levy-Paluk, who has done great research around the world, and now it's bringing out her book, Social Gravity, with the learnings of the past 2 decades of her work, successful work around social norms and social change and network change around the world. And finally, my colleague Boaz Hamidi, who I'm working with, he has been granted with an important grant to understand, okay, how in peace science we can close the divide between systems and the individual. And that's where I just want to touch 2 points to close my talk. First is that there are things happening, and I just want everyone to take attention that behavioral scientists are not on the fence. We are leading that change. I was citing Maria Keshomeru's new report, Handle with Care, Resilience to Fragility, Conflict, and Violence for the World Bank, came out this week. It's fabulous. It's based in behavioral insights, but also on her own work at Busara and her colleagues, using closing the gap between this macro data and also these micro interventions that can change the way we see that divide. Secondly, obviously, I'm biased by the great Antanas Mokus, who showed us how art can change societies in Colombia and in Bogota, and we're trying, in a sense, to revive using that mechanism, using a more narrow view of how we can use methods to make that happen, and how can citizens become scientists when they want to prototype and develop these things. And basically, I go back to the Man, Society, and Behavior that maybe, it's coming from the World Bank report back in 2015, but all the cases are from the advances done in the Global South using all the new things that, in fact, gave out a lot of Nobel Prizes, including Esther Duflo's work on scarcity. And finally, this great work that Jonathan Haidt has been doing, obviously, trying to get accountability for the big tech companies around the world. So I really encourage you to see how behavioral scientists can make a crisis a great opportunity on how to change things. Okay, just to end, the important things about rewiring, as I was saying, is how we can bring the psychological, social, institutional systems together, how we can understand that this field of fear, mistrust, and rigid identities can be also changed with very cost-effective ways, but it depends on guardian coalitions that will make this happen. So this needs upstream change from our part to whisper in the ear of the powerful and the decision makers and the communities who are protagonists and are seeing with fear, the possibility of taking the lead or change, and finally, the important thing of carrying our, like our capacity, just not to, like preach to the choir the idea that we need to think about the system, but really coming up with models that can show us the causality on how to move those two big dimensions. And my last recommendation is, let's go and see this new paper by Juan Camilo Cárdenas. Has a very powerful name. The development revolution will not be notched. The C2 frame approach as a proposal. I think he follows the path of others that have been discussing with Lowenstein and his colleague about this issue. But I think also the behavioral insights team has proposed, and Michael Hasworth offered his manifesto to see how we can do this in a very practical manner. So that's great. But I really, really, really encourage you to read this paper, because it gave us I would say, a clear depiction with tipping points, with the specific mechanisms that are already in place, and how we can use that that mechanism that Jay Bambabel reminded us about, the power of us, and this C2 frame that is working on collective action. Just to end, I would say that Stubbs' work really inspired me, or at least his speech, especially because it was done in India, from India, and was calling up, for many of us to understand that behavioral science is not on the fence, it's not a marginal science. We have the power to overcome, especially this problem of masking, right? Using skewed data to build policy. And I think that's the main thing where we can really take the lead from the global south, because we have 5 things that other countries don't have, or other geographies. We have rich traditions of collective action, great exposure to structural constraints, diverse culture and social context, experience with institutional innovation, right? So in that sense, we can do the 3 things that I believe we need to do. It's basically getting these levels together and designing local institutions that can be scaled up in order to have dialogues between these connectedness that can bring. So this is a picture with Emil with his family, and I just want to close remembering that our societies depend on something that was criticized when Notch came out. The idea that politics were going to be sent out the window and social deliberation was basically not needed anymore, because we have these scientists providing ideas, and we know that's wrong. And we know that the important thing is that reaching that new psychological pact demands understanding that this is a fragile and difficult thing to do, but we need to use all our toolkit basically to bring in this structure of interventions, using this meso level of collective action to install these invisible infrastructures that come from global south. So thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Andres. And now I see that we gave you a really hard task by summarizing all of these topics and research in only 20 minutes. So I could say way longer hearing you discuss these topics. And what I found, I will just start with a question, but please feel free to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to do the questions on your own. But Andres, your talk and your point really remind me of Shafir's and Mulataina's work on scarcity, but in a situation not of poverty and scarcity, but as in under situations of threat. And I think it's a similar, it's a parallel, right? To think of a new perspective that our cognitive processes adopt in such situations. And my question actually is more to give you more space to comment on what kind of interventions that you've been part of or that you've heard that can act as interesting interventions to promote cooperations in these settings.
Okay, that's a great question. And I think, obviously there's a lot of meta-analysis now to think what works and what doesn't, basically on 2 topics, prejudice and basically intergroup animosity. But I think we need to go beyond those mechanisms, because normally we will go back to peace science, peace studies, telling us the importance about intergroup contact, et cetera, right? Like going back to the 70s and bringing all those great findings that were done by social psychologists. But I think that's great. But just to ask your to respond to your question directly, I think we are in a moment where we can understand that just one lever or just moving one lever is not enough. So this idea that we have like rather than multi method in our or multi technique, in my experience, have worked a lot. We try to combine in our work here in Colombia and other places what we do, especially with decision makers or communities, especially on the field, because it's not only, okay, for example, we have a big problem with communities of ex-combatants that now their sons and daughters are big enough because they couldn't have a family before. They were, 30, 20 years in the guerrilla, so they couldn't form families. Now they have families, and the first thing they do when the peace agreement was signed is that there was a baby boom in these communities, and now they're facing, now that they have like their own spaces, their own families that are not governed by the rules of the group. They expressed to me the problem that they have, because they feel they have no agency on parenting, right? And they feel that the agency that they could reclaim comes from their past as fighters, because adolescents specifically are in the age where they can finally, the parents can tell their stories as they were, that are heroic, that especially for women are really empowering, seeing that in Colombia women were fighting the war, right? They had the lead. Even though there were a lot of contradictions and violence against women within all the groups, they were leaders. So now they were asking, okay, how we can disencourage our sons and daughters now that other groups are trying to recruit them forcibly or willingly, to, since there are not other opportunities. What can we do, right? So what we try to do is try to use like a multi-technique approach that will bring, dealing with the biases, dealing with I would say, with the influence of the peers from the kids at school that being exposed to social media, especially TikTok tactics that are being used by criminal groups to recruit them. And then there's a lot of pressure. Being a peer of being a teenager, obviously, is living in the world of peer pressure, and then having these narratives that are being shaped rapidly, because obviously, who doesn't want to be a hero? Who doesn't want to feel power and agency and change all the wrongs that are still in society? So then that's where narrative change come in. But you cannot offer this with an empty tummy, right? You need the infrastructure. You need to also share possibility of going back to your point about scarcity. I also love The World by George Akerlof, that I think it's very marginal in behavioral science. And I think the notion for us in our countries, and see the I would say that, especially in Chicago, they have embraced that the family, becoming a man, interventions, all of that, understanding the importance of cognitive neighborhoods. So I think this is not a one lever strategy. I think we are moving away from being naive, that a notch will change things. I think notch is very important in the specific moment, but we need also to bring in all the other tools that we have, especially using narratives and also structuring, especially government, or as Elinor Ostrom used to say, a local ownership of those solutions.
Perfect. No, super, super interesting, Andres. And I like your point too. There's no single intervention, right? You have to have this multi-level analysis in order to well, work on this really complex issue. We have a question from Ivan. Ivan, if you'd like to do the question, please unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can read it.
Hi. Well, thank you for your brilliant presentation, Andres. What I was thinking about is how to apply all this structure that you were thinking about. you were thinking in the intervention of multilateral organization nudge units or national nudge units or special task forces with each of the conflicts, because the problem that we have is how to put forward all these ideas before the people that they are in charge of, or on the one hand the negotiations to reach peace or to maintaining it. That's I worked in our Argentinian NAT unit, and really it was very hard to work with diplomatics and all that. They have the mindset very far away from what we are used to in behavioral sciences. Thank you very much, Andres.
Ivan, thank you for your question. And in fact, you answered my question for you. And it's that experience in Argentina is very important because, as you know, Buenos Aires government was one of the first governments in having, institutionalized the notch unit in Latin America. The Chileans have a new one in Bogota. We're trying to do that, and I won't depress you with, not because it's bad, because it's very different, because, behavioral science. And then you're trying to do stuff, but you become a copywriter for the communications team. And then you understand what I'm talking about. But yeah, I think that, but let's take, like two real examples. I will, I'm definitely incredibly moved by the work done by Jonathan Haidt with the families of the teens who have committed suicide. Yeah, and they managed to sit down this guy from Meta and having him answer questions, and then taking advantage of these very complex layers of nested games within the federal government, etc., and take the opportunity to find both partisan support to advance this critique toward the not govern, like this unbounded uh, behavior of the tech world. So I think that's one thing. And if we see the mechanisms, is putting yourself as a behavioral scientist not in a notch unit, because I think it depends. As we know, as I say, the vampire proof for a behavioral scientist. If you want to know if he's a real behavioral scientist, you ask, what is the answer to this question? You would say, it depends, right? It's like putting the mirror. So for me, that's the joke that always, it makes people a little bit, they can level their expectations about our work. But I think, again, it's a problem of collective action, because what the brilliantness of Jonathan Haidt is embedding himself into the network of victims, right? Bring his knowledge and collaborate with this writer, right? Like literally, un literato or writer, right? And sat down and write this book about the amazing generation, not the, his previous book was the, I can't remember the name, stressed generation, or the, but now he's talking about the amazing generation, right? And he managed also to get the school district to try this experiment on banning and getting people to voluntarily turn in their phone before going to class in the high schools. And the effect seems to be very good, right? But also it depends on context. Maybe we do that, for example, in my country, where parents, if you don't have, in a sense, a connection with the phone to your kids in public schools, you won't see them at the end of the day, because something may happen where they cannot communicate with you, or you don't have a hold on them. So it depends on context. And then I see other good examples with the diplomatic example with Martin Wallish and colleagues in the innovation cell in the UN during the pandemic. We managed to use VR to take the Security Council to visit Colombia, right, in the headsets, when the Duque government, that was a previous, the president that came up after the peace sign was, the peace process started, and he defunded the whole thing, and in the middle of COVID and a lot of killings against leaders from FARC. So it was great, because what we didn't ask these people to come to Colombia or send a letter, right? We asked them just to travel with their minds and see what these ex-combatants are doing and what their needs are in a positive manner. And we managed to get a resolution out after that experiment by lobbying, also, helping the Colombian mission to lobby. And we had a result. And now we are putting out a paper but because then we iterated the experiment to see if that also moved Colombians who were again against peace after 6-7 years of war, to move them, shift them to a different attitude to support the peace. So I'm giving you two very brief examples. And again, that's a question, right? Should we should we invest in these units? I would say, I don't know. I've been trying to connect in Colombia through that logic, but at the end of the day, I'm still talking to the communications advisor to the major, right? So it's we will find a way to do it depending on each context and it. But I think this we need to take also advantage of the fad that behavioral science has behind it.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Here we have Marisaura Camoes that leads the behavioral NAT unit in Brazil. So she would take advantage of your experience. Thank you very much, Andrés.
Nice. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Andrés. During your presentation, you're talking about how we can overcome these challenges. And you mentioned that rules and governance are not enough. We need more. We need the power of culture, as you said. You need that shift in social norms. But I was wondering which one comes first? How do you sequence that? What we do as a first step and what we do following?
That's a great question, Caro, and I think that again, my answer will be it depends, right? For example, in Colombia, in Bogota, we had like this great experiment, as maybe some of you know about it. If not, you can read it in that World Bank report from 2015, and it's the story of Antanas Mockus, basically a professor, a philosopher who decided to go to politics because of his disillusion, and as a teacher from the teacher movement in Colombia, decided also to, resist the temptation of the left that was not proposing a real change. So I think the importance of belief managers is central to this. If you don't have leaders who understand how people behave, how their own biases can affect them, and then embrace that imperfection. And if you see the story of Antanas Mockus was great because basically what he did, he used this idea that you need to be playful with the citizens. You need to invite them to have fun. If not, they're not gonna. So he did this crazy amount of things. He dressed as Chespirito, but it wasn't Chespirito. Chespirito is a big Mexican, like underdog superhero. It's incredible, about the imperfection of human beings. Antanas used the same cultural driver, using the same uniform, but it was super civico. It was like the super civic agent. And he said, like, I'm super civico, but you can be super civico. And he got people, he was crazy. He was trying to clean the street or whatever. So I'm thinking that not losing the idea that and when I see for example, the incursion of new leaders in the international arena in these moments with a different approach to narratives, but not only because it's political correct, because they believe in being belief managers, I think that's a good shift. And then I would say, yeah, it depends. If you ask Cristina Vicchieri, she would say also you cannot expect like a social norm to work like equally in every context. You need to understand what expectation you need to move, right? And then who in the reference network will start the revolution within that reference network. So again, as we learned from those projects, incredible projects in Africa, right? Like Salima, right? We have like these powerful coalitions between religious authorities, parents, and girls as agents, and using, like cartoons and song and dancing as a way, and also the imams, like the religious authorities being part of the change, trying also to like to fight against the myths that sustain bad behavior in terms of violence against girls and women.
Just a curiosity, Chespirito is very famous in Brazil. El Chavo del Ocho.
El Chavo del Ocho, yes.
And in Argentina.
Yeah, it's very famous.
Great. Andres, on the sake of time, we have to wrap up, but thank you so much. It was super interesting. For all participants, we'll be sending the recording for you that have registered. And yeah, please do follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and join our WhatsApp group to be up to date with the next events. We'll probably have one in the so May. And on
Just
that
one
note,
thing,
thank you.
Flora,
Yes, of
very
course.
fast. If you can, then we can on the network on your social media, we can share the recording for the last Neuropaz. I think people will really
Yeah.
get inspired by the whole day was incredible. We didn't wait for that but to happen, but we have President Santos, we had Bescy, we have Hala Systems, the guys that are using AI to protect people in Syria. It's incredible. So it's gonna be really exciting for people.
Yeah, it was amazing, and definitely we have more material there to think through in more depth. So thank you very much for all of you that attended, and see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.